Gresham College presents Thinking Theologically About Modern Art, Part 3, Sensing the Sacred, by Professor Francis Spalding, CBE.
Well, may I begin by thanking Lord Harris for kindly inviting me or giving me the opportunity to take part in this day event. It will become apparent that I'm a bit stronger on art than on theology. What theology I have, I suppose, has been gained largely through listening to sermons, so I hope it will see me through this track. Anyway, I'm in sympathy with much that's been said. We live in an age that is made marvellous by science and technology, owing to the internet and globalization. We can rummage in the past, easily gaining access to the images from and information about the ancient world and cultures very different to our own. There is an embarrassment of riches out there, accessible by means of a few taps on the iPad, the laptop, or the mobile phone. And this greater reach and speed of communications also brings us a wide range of contacts, friends, requests, petitions, engagements, notices of forthcoming activities, and so on, to such an extent that opening one's inbox in email is increasingly becoming the main task of the day. Now, in among all this noise and busyness, where do we go to discern the sacred, that quality or presence which stills, questions, and inspires? Ruskin found it in the brilliant blue of the gentian flower and in peacock feathers, which the two that you see he drew here. Admittedly, this was in part because he believed that all nature was God's creation and therefore an expression of divinity. Well, divinity may run through all things and perhaps even the internet, but the sacred is defined, at least in the Oxford English Dictionary, as something set apart. This implies, I think, a psychological or physical or geographical distance from the ordinary and everyday. The dictionary definition goes on to say that the sacred is dedicated for or to some religious purpose or made holy by its association with other objects of worship. Or it can also be a place or object regarded with a respect and a reverence similar to that which reaches out, attaches itself to holy things. So something as simple as a group of time-worn stones, which when arranged in a spiral formation can deliver a powerful sense of attraction, the specialness that arises from our deepened awareness of their shape and texture and relatedness within the spiral pattern. In T.S. Eliot's words, only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness. And so from what we can learn about the sacred, at least from the OED, it seems that it requires of the artist and the craftsman and the viewer a special form of attention, and that though often found in a religious context, it reaches beyond that context, gathering association with objects, through association with objects that have, however, it can arise from association with objects like these and have objects that perhaps begin to have a special appropriateness or importance to us for some reason. I think the sacred is also something that can be associated with labour, with in the traditional arts and crafts phrase, the making well of whatever needs making, and hence Eric Gill's insistence that he couldn't start work before his work table was as clean and well ordered, as well prepared as an altar. Here is an instance of a work of art that I think takes on a sense of the sacred as a result of its association with a particular place and other objects of worship. It's a four-panel painting by Alison Watt, hung in square formation so that together it makes an 8-foot square image, which hangs in midair over the altar in Old St. Paul's in Edinburgh in a side chapel, one wall of which is entirely filled with the names of those who died in the First and Second World Wars. Ostensibly, this is just another of a whole series of paintings that Alison Watt produced based on the pleats and declivities made by the folds of cream or white cloth. The starting point for this series had been her interest in the stillness and perfectionism found in the neoclassical paintings by the French artist J.A.D. Ingres. In St. Paul's, this subject matter, seemingly mute and devoid of narrative, invites various associations and evokes an elegiac mood. The falling movement of the cloth, as it gathers into a cusp and then unfurls, carries a reminiscence of other kinds of cloth, winding cloths or veils or sheets. It is interesting that this work was not commissioned. Instead, the artist herself, after a bout of illness, decided that she wanted to place a painting in a church, and it was only after walking around and looking at a variety of churches that she came to an agreement with Old St. Paul's for what was initially understood to be a temporary installation. But I suspect that even the artist may have been surprised by the way that associations and a sense of the sacred silently gathered around this work, once hung in position in this grave setting. So while the light fails, if I might be permitted to misquote Eliot, on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now, and Scotland. Doesn't quite work, does it? An awareness that we might be about to enter a space set apart and made sacred gives a certain tension to our struggle to open ancient doors to churches or lady chapels on our sightseeing expeditions. This is the door to the Lady Chapel at Long Melford in Suffolk, one of the great wool churches. And here, of course, even before we go inside, we are aware of a great hymn to the sacred in this glorious combination of glass and tracery and napped stone. Even small details in relative insignificant corners of the exterior express, through craftsmanship, a reverence and respect for the building. And inside we not only find a wonderfully airy nave, as well as a new lighting system which is made visible by those rather stylish modern chandeliers, but also a robust set of choir seats and, inset into one side wall, an alabaster relief. This was found buried in the foundations of the church in the 18th century, and it dates back, they think, to the 12th century, therefore before the current Long Melford church was built. And it surprises one into wonder, not just by its age, but through such details as the maid or angel plumping up the cushions, the pillow behind the Virgin, the snouts of the, I think, cows appearing underneath the bed, and above all, I think, perhaps by the gesture of the first king who's delivered his present to the Christ child and is so relieved, or perhaps a bit discombobulated, that he's pushing back his crown with weariness and emotion. Well, things that are set apart require us to travel in order to see them. But most religious buildings invite us to embark on a journey or a quest for the sacred, and nowhere more so than here in Lincoln Cathedral. This magnificent vista, insistently axial, immediately excites. It draws us into the nave and on the start of a quest that in liturgical terms leads us, of course, to the high altar. But at this end of the nave, we cannot see the high altar, partly because of the screen which intercepts the flow of movement from the nave into the choir and the sacristy. The medieval mass had been practically invisible, screened off at the end of the chancel at the east end, the congregation merely passive observers of the priestly Latin mumming. A building of this kind presents problems today, and many would say that it ill suits modern liturgical practices. An ingenious solution to this has been found at Lichfield Cathedral, where again you get this strong axial movement drawing us towards the distant altar at the east end. But if you look at this, you can perhaps see that modern choir stalls have been installed in the nave halfway down. And in front of these, you will find, as you walk down, this magnificent new pattern in the pavement, which can be raised hydraulically to form a stepped platform and therefore form a temporary altar. The sacred ingeniously rising up out of the floor at the flick of a switch. At the heart of developments in liturgy during the 1950s and 60s was this bringing forward of the altar in order to foreground the sacred, in an attempt to break down psychological barriers between minister and congregation, bringing all within sight and sound of the celebration of the Mass. And sometimes, as you will know, altars were permanently moved into the nave, because modern liturgy places the minister at the heart of an active congregation, the spirit more usually now communal and vernacular. Now, this liturgical revolution interests me in relation to my subject, as it seems to me that it also sought to uncover new ways in which to make palpable the sacred. It was, of course, most marked in the Roman Catholic Church, and as a result of the Second Vatican Council, tens of thousands of altars were moved westwards so that the priest could celebrate Mass facing the congregation. One consequence of this, which cannot be denied, is that many ancient buildings suffered a degree of aesthetic vandalism. But another consequence of this liturgical movement was a much more adventurous policy in relation to artistic patronage. And after decades during which church buildings had usually erred on the side of caution and traditionalism, certain innovative buildings arose that set a new model for church commissioning. And of course, a prime example of this is Le Corbusier's famous pilgrimage chapel, Notre du Haut, set atop a wild and windswept foothill of the Vosges Mountains at Ronchamp. It was completed in 1955, and the north side, which you see here, is remarkable in its shapes and presence. It startled many at the time because, of course, Corbusier was associated with functionalism. And here was a building that employed lyricism and poetry, not a bit of sculpture too, in the service of the church, which Corbusier had pronounced earlier as a dead institution. Yet there is no denying the intense spirituality associated or conveyed by this extraordinary building. And in his short speech, which Corbusier made at its consecration, he remarked, and I quote him, "Some things are sacred and others are not, whether they are religious or not." Now, aware that religious content or literary association did not guarantee sacredness in art, had made the man behind this commission, Father Marie-Alain Couturier in France, determined to break with conventional imagery within the Catholic Church and to employ artists who might not be practicing Christians, but whose work had integrity. And this Dominican had done much in France to set in motion the aforementioned adventurous policy of artistic patronage. Couturier and Pierre-Raymond Régamay had edited the influential magazine La Sacrée from 1937 until 1954. And Couturier had been responsible for commissioning work from Léger, Bonnard, Braque, Chagall, Matisse, Rouault, and Germain Riquier for the church Notre-Dame de Toute Grâce at Assy. He'd also acted as advisor for the chapel designed by Matisse for the Dominican nuns at Vence. And in all these commissions, Couturier firmly upheld the principle of artistic freedom, famously declaring, as you can see here, better to commission geniuses without faith than believers without talent. And by so doing, he succeeded in demonstrating that modern art of the highest order could be accommodated by the church. Couturier was aware that in Scandinavia and on the continent by this date, new ideas about architecture and liturgy had encouraged an interest in structural clarity, and a liking for bare wood and unrendered stone or concrete. Ornamentation or conventionally religious atmosphere were being rejected in favour of a new austerity. Now, admittedly, Ronchamp is a complex building. It's radically different on all four sides. Here is the famous south wall with its fenestration, irregular and varied in size. The wall actually thickens as it reaches the ground, and it is also hollow. And inside, the increasing thickness allows for the embrasures, which, as you can see, widen as they get towards the further down. It enables those embrasures to act like loudspeakers or megaphones for the light. And as a result, even when the sun is not out and the sky is overcast, the building contains explosions of light and colour, colours that vibrate against the rough, whitewashed walls. It has been said of this building by two architectural historians, the total effect is of a mighty fortress, pierced by shafts of light, and creating here the quietude of shadow, there the glowing radiance of reflection, and again the stab of intense fiery colour. And they continue, one can only assume that consciously or subconsciously, Corbusier meant his theme to symbolize the opening out of the human soul towards the passion and mystery of the Christian faith. Whether or not you accept that interpretation, there is no denying that wherever one looks, the sacred is expressed by means of radical simplicity. Look at these magnificent pews made out of concrete and wood, or the plainness of the altar, painted white, no frontal, against the white walls, or the sort of clunky simplicity of the communion rail. What's interesting here is that there's complete absence of ornament or clutter, and what we're left with is leaving the liturgical purpose of every part boldly and simply exposed. Now, economic necessity does not alone explain this simplicity. It had been fired in part by the liturgical movement, which wanted places of worship to recover the Christian qualities of poverty, humility, and simplicity, and to become once again places of silence, reflection, perhaps stillness and prayer. And this had begun to make itself felt earlier in the 20th century at, for instance, Auguste Perret's Notre Dame in Rancy, an eastern suburb of Paris. In the early 1920s, Abbé Nègre, who had set about building this church, must have been a man of unusual courage. He wanted to build a church that would seat approximately or close to 2,000 people, and he realized that he simply did not have the money to enable him to go to an established ecclesiastical architect. The cost would have been well beyond what his financial resources were. So he turned instead to a man who had never built a church before, but who had established a European reputation as a master of reinforced concrete construction. Perret is on record as saying, "It is through the splendour of truth that a building attains beauty." And the result in 1923 was a building that conveyed the sense of a sacred in a new way. I've shown it to you first in black and white because I think you spatially can move around it better. The altar is brought forward, there's an ambulatory that goes behind it. But of course the point of this building is the colour, and it's much, much more intense than you see in this rather extremely unsatisfying slide. One person who praised it at the time by saying, "Here at last was a church of real integrity, an honest piece of reinforced concrete construction, devoid of meretricious ornament and irrelevant detail." What many appreciated was, as I said, the way the altar had come forward, nearer the congregation. The pillars supporting the roof had shrunk to slender rods and did not impede vision, and the walls had dissolved into a honeycomb of cement filled with coloured glass. This glass, as I say, inadequately represented here, changes colour, possibly through the liturgical seasons, I'm not sure, but it seems to, as you walk round the church, and you end up at the east end with a very, very deep, intense blue, much more intense than you see here, in which is illustrated the crucifixion by means of large red dots. Marguerite Huret's glass was one example that helped John Piper towards his abstract design for the Baptistry Window at the new Coventry Cathedral. But before setting his ideas down, he travelled round France, looking at modern church architecture. He not only visited Ronchamp and Matisse's chapel at Vence, but he also went here, Audincourt, a suburb of Montbéliard, where Peugeot cars are made, in order to see this church with stained glass running round the whole the three walls of it by Fernand Léger. I'm sorry that you can't see it very clearly in this slide. It also has a small baptistry attached to one side, in which the entire walls are made out of stained glass by Jean Bazin. And this last must surely have set a precedent, as we'll see later, for Piper's work at Liverpool. But in all these places, Piper would have encountered a new vigour and an emblematic simplicity. Now, when designing the baptistry window at Coventry, he had initially toyed with including references to the Ark, Sinai, perhaps Pentecost, or the dove. But eventually, he and Patrick Rentians, the stained glass maker with whom he collaborated, decided to abandon any representational material. Instead, the window would convey its message solely through colour, and it was to be colossal, theatrical, and uncompromisingly abstract. Piper described his design as a blaze of light framed and islanded in colour, a blaze of light symbolising the Holy Spirit. But he wrote that 4 years after the design had been accepted. And according to Rentians, when the bishop, Cuthbert Bardsley, asked Piper at a meeting in December 1957 if there was any symbolism in his design, he simply replied, "No, I don't think there really is, apart from the idea of a great burst of light and grace." Again, with this, you can get no adequate slide of this enormous window. You can see a little person sitting there, so you get some sense of the size. But Piper himself loved this effect that you get early summer mornings, because the cathedral is built not on the east-west alliance, but the north-south. Apparently visiting preachers who take early morning communion in the chapel opposite the baptistry come out and sometimes see the burst of light almost doubled, and perhaps slightly exaggerated by the camera here, but to such an extent that it seems as if the sun has come into the church. And there are other lovely moments where, even in dull weather, the colours are reflected in the black marble floor around the font, or when the colours of the windows speckle the congregation gathered round the font for a baptistry, the colours becoming part of the liturgy. Whether or not, as a visitor, one accepts the symbolism of the light of Christ or the Holy Spirit, this sun-like effect does reach across divisions often created by religious beliefs in its communication of a regenerative and transformative power. The liturgical movement was, of course, international and began in France in the 19th century. It had been influential on church building in France and Germany and Switzerland in the interwar years, but its impact didn't really reach Britain until after 1945. And it eventually owed much to one man. That was Peter Hammond, the rector of Baggendon in Gloucestershire, who had initially trained before his ordination at art school and became zealous in his determination to bring new liturgical ideas to an architectural audience. 1958, he published a liturgical brief, a provocative look at new church planning, in the Architectural Review, and he followed it with two seminal books, Liturgy and Architecture in 1960 and Towards a New Church Architecture in 1962, that latter title echoing Corbusier's own book, Towards a New Architecture. I want to show how an instance of this liturgical movement had a practical impact on the restoration of an ancient small church. This is Toodley, some 3 miles south of Tunbridge in Kent. Around 1966, the local Davidor Goldschmidt family decided to commission a stained glass window for this east window from Chagall. They wanted to commemorate the death of their daughter, who died in a sailing accident while still a young woman. And as a result, this small church underwent restoration at the hands of an architect called Robert Potter, who had travelled around the continent with one of Peter Hammond's books in his bag, looking at all the buildings he wrote about, and who had also been inspired at Chichester by the famous Dean, Walter Hussey, the patron of art and music and the man who was committed to innovations in sacred architecture. Piper's work at Tudley was overseen by John Piper. Now, this is an old photograph of the East End, taken, I think, probably around the 1920s, and you can see that it's fairly well filled with Victorian clutter. What Piper and Potter did was to remove that, I don't know whether they'd be allowed to today, and to create a very different, obviously the shape of the window had to be changed for the Chagall window to be put in place. They kept the 17th century monument on the left-hand side, but essentially they removed much Victorian clutter. And it seems to me that this restoration, admittedly it's a relatively small space to be dealing with, does release a powerful sense of purpose, order, calm and peace, and in so doing, perhaps a sense of the sacred. When this Chagall window was put in place in 1968, Chagall came to see it in position and was so pleased with the result, he promptly offered to do every other window in the small church. And some were delighted, but not all the congregation, as there were 2 Victorian windows, which they were rather fond of. And so some 9 years later, after a lot of arguing, the Victorian windows were moved to the vestry, and Chagall did indeed do all the other small windows in the church. And so as a result, this tiny church has become a place of pilgrimage for many. Now, during the post-war period, with a great many churches and cathedrals in this country having been damaged or destroyed in the war, opportunities to build or rebuild churches were greater than at any other time since the medieval period. However, most churches in this country, though hostage to a great deal of restoration in the 19th century, had, like Tudley, remained largely untouched in the first half of the 20th century. So, if not moribund, they had become stuck in a style or use that related to a former age and to its liturgical practices of that age. And though England was a long way behind developments in church building that were taking place on the continent and in Scandinavia at this time, by the early 1960s, there was nevertheless a sudden demand for innovation, for a breaking with conventional designs, and for new ways of expressing the sacred. Now, Corbusier had always pointed out that a crucial ingredient in any piece of architecture is light. He said the key is light, and light illuminates shapes, and shapes have emotional power. And in churches and cathedrals, this use of light is often enriched or qualified by stained glass. John Piper was greatly inspired as a stained glass designer by a remark made by the painter Alfred Manessier, to the effect that he had come to think of stained glass less as a design than as a simultaneous creation of a light-filled architectural unit, thought out and created by the painter at one go. This realization that stained glass is inextricably bound up with architecture and light determined much that Piper did. He once said that the function, the flesh and blood and bones of stained glass, is its whole being, is to qualify light and to intensify atmosphere in a room or a building, not necessarily to provide colour or a message. And it is by means of qualifying light that Piper helped strengthen a sense of the sacred in St. Margaret's, Westminster, the 15th century church that sits right beside Westminster Abbey. It had lost all its Victorian glass in bomb blasts during the war, and a bathroom glass had been installed until the War Damages Commission came up with some money, which was thought enough just to restore one stained glass window. Piper was brought in, and it seemed to him unwise to put in a single window, as it would have to compete with the great east window, which had survived the war, made in Flanders in 1501, to commemorate the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Henry VIII. He therefore proposed that instead of filling one window with stained glass, they do the whole 8 that run along this wall, and in a simple way. And this was agreed, and some extra money was found. And so this glazing system fills some 8 windows. Piper, again working with Rentians, devised, as you can see, an unaggressive screen or filter for the daylight. And it just modifies the light slightly and creates this rather grave and serious sort of atmosphere, adding, I think, to the sense of the sacred already evoked by the setting. Nor do these windows interfere with those Baroque monuments that you saw punctuating the wall. And despite an immediate protest when they were put in that their modernity was wholly inappropriate for a building of this age, the protesters quickly forgot about them. And that is exactly what Piper hoped would happen, that he didn't do them as windows to draw attention to themselves so much as to engage with light. Well, Piper designed, as you probably know, a great deal of stained glass, and the final example I want to show you this morning that I think adds to the sense of the sacred created by a building, again involves glass designed by him and Rentians. It also happens to be the first cathedral to break with the longitudinal planning, and became, as you probably know, the most famous expression of the new liturgical thinking in Britain, Liverpool's Roman Catholic Cathedral, built between 1962 and 67. This was about the 3rd or 4th attempt to build a Roman Catholic cathedral in Liverpool, and I'm not going to go into its complicated prehistory, except just to say that it was only in 1930 that they found this 9-acre site, formerly occupied by a workhouse at the top of Mount Pleasant and Brownlow Hill. And this ensured, as you can see from this slide, that the building would be seen in relation to the Anglican Cathedral, already at the time beginning to rise. And so eventually these 2 great churches would crown the horizon, as we see here. In the 1930s, the task of building a Catholic cathedral had been given to Sir Edwin Lutyens, and we can get an idea of what he intended from a gigantic wooden model for the cathedral now in Liverpool's Walker Art Gallery. Lutyens wanted a dome larger than St Paul's Cathedral, reaching a height of 510 feet, and a building which in size would have exceeded St Peter's in Rome. Foundation stone had been laid in 1933, and work had begun, and in fact the crypt was more or less completed and brought into use shortly before Lutyens died. But its phenomenal size pointed up how impossible it would be after the Second World War to complete this original scheme. By 1955, the cost of building Lutyens' design would have been not 3 million, but 27 million. And Adrian Gilbert Scott was asked to scale down Lutyens' design and produce a compromise solution, but these plans never really left the drawing board. And then in 1959, by which time John Carmel Heenan had become Archbishop of Liverpool, of course later Cardinal, an open competition was announced for the new cathedral to link it with the existing crypt. The competition took place in 1960, and the brief for the building was that it should seat 2,000 people and could be built within 5 years at a cost of £1 million in 1960 terms. Now, this brief was prepared just before the Second Vatican Council clarified the liturgical arrangements, which would bring significant changes in church design. Yet already that liturgical wind of change that I've been talking about was sweeping altars eastwards towards the heart of the congregation. And in a letter to the competitors for the right to build this building, Archbishop Heenan wrote the following: "The high altar is the central feature of every Catholic church. It must be the focus of the new building. The trend of the liturgy is to associate the congregation ever more closely with the celebrant of the Mass. The high altar is not a monument to embellish the cathedral building. The cathedral, on the contrary, is built to enshrine the altar of sacrifice. The attention of all those who enter should be arrested and held by the altar. So the central remit, of course, was to bring out the sanctity of the altar, and Frederick Gibbard, designer of London Airport and Harlow Newtown, and with a large and prestigious practice, of course, won the competition with a centralised plan. Here you see the cathedral being built. It was to be 194 feet in diameter, and it would seat just over 2,000 people. It would allow all of those people to gather within 70 feet of the central sanctuary. And Lutyens' massive crypt was retained, but it was roofed over. Gibbard recognised that the weakness of the central plan is that it lacks direction, but he overcame this to some extent by placing the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at the far side. But what really won over the judges for the competition was his decision to create the shape of the building so that it powerfully expressed the title of the cathedral, which was Christ the King. So it expresses through its coronet, as it were, on top of the building, the kingship of Christ. Designed like a crown, around its walls there are 16 reinforced concrete trusses, shaped like boomerangs, which converge into this ring at the foot of the tower. It was accepted, I think, at the beginning that any material fit for purpose could be employed, and this enabled it to be built by means of industrial methods as well. And while the Anglican Cathedral, which took 60 years to build, was steadily creeping forward stone by stone, this was actually built in under 5 years, in 4 years, and it was consecrated on the 17th of May, 1967. Piper designed the stained glass that frames each of the side chapels, which you can see some of which around the side. This obviously is the consecration, and the church does look magnificent when it is full. It works less well, unfortunately, when the congregation is more ragged. But a slide of it shown empty, taken recently, shows you the effect of the light of the glass that Piper introduced round the sides of those chapels. And it helped block out daylight. It's inspired by the intense blues found in 13th century glass. It's not only psychologically necessary to the building, but it's also a way of creating a sense of the sacred. There's some bits of slight green within it, and there are also small flecks of red, infiltrated high up in a way that is said to be representative of tongues of flame. Now, with regard to the lantern, Piper and Rentiens, whom you see here painting cartoons for it, had just 18 months in which to produce 16 slightly tapering panels, each 30 foot tall and about 14 foot wide. And their chosen material was dalle de verre, a suitably tough form of glass being an inch thick, which made unnecessary concrete divisions. Instead, each section is reinforced by transverse divisions, horizontal bars, and crisscross reinforcements. Piper recognized from the start that as the lantern was some 200 feet above the floor, the effect of light and color achieved would have to be simple in character and bold in manner. But it was Rentiens, who at the time was reading Dante's Paradiso, who had the idea that they could convey the idea of the Trinity simply by the same use of light as is found in that book by Dante, blue, gold, yellow, and green, and red, and thereby evoking the Trinity by means of these three great bursts of coloured light. Here it is the richness of colour that seems to evoke the sacred. This massive tower includes just over 12,000 square feet of glass, but it is no arbitrary addition but an extension of the sanctuary, because the dominant external form is over the dominant internal object, the high altar. Of course, it's been subsequently nicknamed, this is the other side showing you the blue, Paddy's Wigwam. And within 2 decades, I think it did become dated, but it has been recently renovated at some cost, it has to be admitted, and continues to inspire. I think partly because that central space does remain powerful, and the pervading blue lights is a very successful mood-creating part of it. Piper certainly had a lifelong fascination with those intense blues of medieval glass, and in 1992, when the historian John Nelson Turn reassessed the cathedral, he insisted that the climax of the building is still high above in the lantern, the super rich jewel-like glass of John Piper and Patrick Rentians that immediately draws the eye away from nearly everything else. But it is at night time, as you see here, when lit from the inside, that it best performs its crown-like function, and the jewel-like colours of the glass shine out against the pale, floodlit shell. Well, what I've not touched on this morning is the relation of the sacred to beauty, with which it is often aligned, nor perhaps to its relation to perfection. Perhaps these qualities are not necessary but contingent to the sacred. I do not know what it is like to belong to a house church and worship in someone's living room, but I do know that St. Paul warns us, the ear cannot say to the eye, I have no need of you. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. The sacred seems to require us to use our senses and to search for it in things outside ourselves, from the past as well as the present. Gerardus van Veluwe once argued that the image of the crucified Christ, humiliated and problematic, yet eternally worthy of worship, as he puts it, contains within it a justification for all human attempts at creating form. He saw in the crucifixion the possibility of the miracle, I quote him, which we can never attain, but which is given us by grace, the expression of the holy through the beautiful. Virginia Woolf tried to say something similar, I think, in a letter to Gerald Brennan, that beauty, she said, is only got by the failure to get it, by grinding all the flints together, by facing what must be humiliation, the things one can't do. And with that paradox, I think I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Francis. Well, as other people are just gathering their thoughts of their questions, which I'm sure there'll be a lot. Perhaps I could put one, just preface it with a comment. I revisited Coventry Cathedral recently, and although in recent years people have said, well, of course, Coventry Cathedral was the last of the medieval cathedrals, the real modern cathedral was the Roman Catholic Metropolitan Cathedral, it struck me when I revisited it how wonderfully Coventry Cathedral still stands up. Yes. Although it was not in tune with the best liturgical thinking at the time, somehow it has lasted well. But my question is about the liturgical movement and the Metropolitan Cathedral. It's interesting that Cardinal Heenan, in that quotation you gave, yes, suggested the focus should be the high altar. Yes. But actually, the main theme of the liturgical movement was that the focus should be the people gathered round the altar, because there is the body of Christ risen, taking up Ben's point in his first lecture. So this is a question to which I have no answer, and it doesn't matter if you haven't got one, but perhaps Ben or George can answer one. And that is, how do we express this emphasis of the liturgical movement, that it is in the people where the divine incarnate now dwell. That's where the sacred should be, not in the building as such. But have you got any... I'm afraid that's rather a difficult question.
I think I would prefer to hear it answered by either of the two theologians.
Ben has got an answer. Let's Ben... So can we have the answer to Ben to that one, and then we'll open it up.
Thanks. It's not an answer, but it's a suggestion in relation to Coventry that the full effect of the stained glass, not the baptistry, but the stained glass along the walls of the cathedral, is only got when you have when you are at the liturgical east end and turn and face west, so that actually you're facing away from the altar in order to get the full effect of those windows that are those long vertical windows which go all the way down each wall. And I think that's a very intelligent way to reorient you and send you out again into, well, first of all, to look at the congregation, or to look in congregation woods, and also beyond that, to send you back out into the world. And of course, the magnificent, again, liturgical west window, it's not literally west, enables you to see the world outside through these beautiful engraved angelic figures, and again connects you back to the outside world. So it's not all altar focused, which is very interesting.
Thank you. And I saw my wife nodding vigorously because I know she strongly agrees with that point. So a question now for Francis, please. Yes.
I just wondered if by any chance you felt that the Roman Catholics having the reserved sacrament over the high altar might have something to do with the fact that they needed to have that as a focal point, even though they've got that lovely altar in the centre.
What do you think about
I don't know. I got no answer to that.
This is for George, I think, yes. I can't answer it, so I'm going to ask George to answer it. He's probably got a better knowledge of church history than me.
Well, probably not, actually. But clearly the reserved sacrament is going to make a difference to all sorts of issues about the internal ordering of a church or the absence thereof. But I don't really have an answer to that. But if I could briefly go back to the other question about the people of God. I mean, I have to admit, one of my foibles is my reservations vis-a-vis the liturgical movement is precisely this sort of self-conception of the church as the people of God, you know, and the continued affirmation in certain liturgies of we are the people of God. And in a sense, there's, you know, nothing more ungodlike than the serried ranks of a church congregation saying we are the people of God. And you know, the humanity in which one sees God. I mean, maybe you sort of catch an individual in the congregation, a child or an old person or whatever, or you go outside. And of course, older churches, which weren't committed to abstraction, some of the wonders of medieval churches are the portrayals of human figures in situations of vulnerability, in Stations of the Cross, indeed another much more Catholic tendency, though not unknown in Anglicanism, to see human figures that express the kind of vulnerability that the Gospels draw our attention to in things like the sheep and the goats. But
Right, and a question there for Francis, yes.
A suggestion in reply to your question, Bishop Richard, is to have, with an East End focus, to have a clear window at the East End. I can think of, for example, the Canongate Church in Edinburgh looks out to Colton Hill, and I gather Mother Teresa's Home of the Dying, in her chapel there was a window that looked straight out on busy Calcutta, and she said that was so important that at the altar she could never forget the people for whom God cares.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that at all?
Well, there is a very nice, isn't Fitzwilliam Chapel in Cambridge that has a window onto a tree, which is rather lovely too for some reason. And of course, as somebody mentioned, the stained glass, the clear glass at the end of the modern cathedral at Coventry has a wonderful role, because as you step down come down the steps of the ruin, cross the public walkway which brilliantly moves between the two cathedrals, you momentarily see the old ruin reflected in the glass windows at the same time that you're able to see through to the Graham Sutherland tapestry at the far end. So the coming together of past and present is rather wonderful at that moment.
I'm not sure how to express this, but it seemed to me there were two words which were missing today. One was mystery. I think, Francis, you used the word once in the whole of your fascinating and instructive lecture, and I didn't, maybe my memory, but I didn't hear it earlier on this morning. And the other word was the word eternal. And I'm pondering why this is so, and I suspect it's because the whole theme of today has been to try to explain the inexplicable and to demystify the ultimately mysterious. I'm trying to find a parallel in another sphere, and that is in the sphere of music. I'm just fascinated by music, and particularly religious music. And I've been trying for several years to put pen to paper in the form of a book about what drove particular musicians to write as they did. And I find ultimately that it's a fruitless exercise to try to explain ultimately stuff which is mysterious. And I'm wondering, that's as far as I can go. I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on the fact that it did seem to me that we're seeking to explain things which, to the ordinary person going into these great buildings, they are satisfied by the fact that it is mysterious alone, and they do not need to have a clear explanation of what the guy was trying to do.
Yes, well, surely one of the motivations behind many musicians must have been that they can do something that you can't do with words and get to areas that you can't. And I think there's nothing more magnificent than perhaps walking into Notre Dame in Paris and hearing Messiaen played on a fantastic organ. And you don't need to have anything explained. You just sort of viscerally learn something about what the Christian faith is about. So, yes, it's I do hope you write your paper. It should be much needed. I think why people are uneasy of using the term mystery is because of Dawkins and others who accuse Christians of superstitious nonsense and resorting to a mystery and, and so I think it's there. Of course it must be there. The mystery between the divine and the human in Christ is something that is impossible to adequately explain, despite all that has been said and written about it. But it's, I suppose, if you go anywhere near academics, you know that you mustn't mention geniuses, you mustn't mention mystery, and there's a whole lot of other verboten words, I'm afraid. So that's probably why we've been rather feebly staying clear of it today.
Could you comment on the sense of the sacred that people experience in the great Islamic mosques? I'm also thinking of Neil McGregor at the British Museum saying how in the Afghan exhibition and the Islam exhibition presently, and they've had a Syrian exhibition, that the sense of the sacred is palpable. I remember too Anthony Gormley giving a lecture about the Buddhist sculptures and saying that as far as he was concerned, when he was in their presence, he had a sense of the sacred. And lastly, because we know that Jewish artists have a sense often of prohibition about works which may have a figurative internet. I have a friend who was in Auschwitz and who does a lot of sculptures for our cathedrals. And she, in the chapel of Great Ormond Street Hospital, where people go to mourn the death and serious illness of their children, has created a very small sculpture. And if one looks at the book of condolence that is there, the people very often from other cultures who go into that chapel say, sitting and looking at that sculpture has given me a sense of the sacred, of holiness at a difficult time in their intimate religious lives.
Could you just briefly describe the sculpture? Could you just briefly describe the sculpture in that chapel?
Yes, it's by Naomi Blake, and I can't tell you the title.
Yes.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Francis.
Thank
Give you.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.